the legal framework that governs parole, because then that will set the foundation for highlighting the challenges and thereafter the recommendations that PMRC wishes to make. So parole is governed principally by the Constitution of Zambia, Amendment Act number 2 of 2016, wherein the citizens of the Republic are guaranteed civil and political rights. And also, we have the Zambia Correctional Services Act number 37 of 2021, which is the legislation that governs prisons and the operations of the correctional services. And in this piece of legislation, we have a definition of what parole is, and that is found in section 2 of that act, wherein we are told that it is essentially how a convicted person will be given conditional release for the remainder of a sentence in community in which they will be discharged into. The Act also contains the Parole Rules. These rules stipulate how parole is to be administered and procedure for granting such parole, how to be supervised and how it to be monitored. We also have the Probation of Offenders Act, which is not entirely related to parole, but does support anything related to a non-custodial sentence. So any offender serving or who has committed an offense for which a sentence is not stipulated is eligible for parole. We also have United Nations standards that govern custodial and non-custodial sentences, and also how prisoners are to be treated. So the first of these is the Tokyo Rules, also known as the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for Non-Custodial Measures. This is principally a set of principles that promote the use of non-custodial measures, as well as minimum safeguards for persons who are subject to imprisonment. And they're intended to see that offenders see a sense of responsibility to society as they're serving their sentences. The Tokyo Rules make provision for legal standards. Document the submission does set out the salient rules that are particularly of importance to parole. Here we've got what will attract non-custodial measures and how member states are expected to ensure that these are reflected in their legal systems. We have a rule also on how assessment of established criteria of the nature and gravity of offenses are going to be determinants for the imposition of non-custodial sentences. We have a rule, that's Rule 10.1 in the document at page 4, that provides for supervision for the purpose of reducing reoffending and to assist in the offender's reintegration back into society. It is important that we bear at the back of our minds that parole is really meant to ensure that an offender is reintegrated back into society and into the community, possibly where the offense actually took place. So that can be quite difficult because sometimes communities are not very receptive. So the UN standards actually guide on how correctional services in member states can actually perform this. We also have what are known as the Nelson Mandela Rules, and these are the minimum standard rules for treatment of prisoners. They are essentially the normative standard for the treatment of prisoners, and they establish that provision of meaningful rehabilitation in prison is critical to reducing recidivism. This is where an offender serves a sentence, goes back into the community and reoffends. So the Nelson Mandela Rules actually guide on how this can be minimized. Parole should be viewed through the lens of the aims of imprisonment. The aims of imprisonment being to punish, but also to rehabilitate. But we know that the state of our prisons really doesn't afford much in terms of rehabilitation. So that's where the rules come in, and how we are going to treat prisoners in terms of how to actually reintegrate them back into society. So it is also important that these rules point us at the objectives of justice and diversion of some offenses from the criminal justice system. So here I'm just trying to establish the international standards that the correctional service follows in treating offenders, convicts, and those at the tail end of serving their sentences. These two sets of rules complement each other in terms of ensuring that the rights of prisoners serving sentences in correctional facilities are protected and are governed by agreed upon principles. So this will apply to custodial as well as non-custodial sentences. Now, regarding the efficiency of the parole and correctional supervision system in Zambia, this falls under the direct mandate of the Zambia Correctional Services, but it also works with other role players. Here we have the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services, and together they provide the necessary mechanisms for the serving of sentences for offenders. The Correctional Service and the Ministry collaborate on probation and supervision of offenders because they require the same officers. Social welfare officers as well as probation officers are the ones who actually drive the process of supervising offenders. So whether this is actually yielding results, we need more inquiries into that. And in the performance of its role in supervising and monitoring, the Commissioner of Prisons may appoint extension officers from among prison officers who are qualified in social welfare. So where that is not available, they still go into the Ministry of Community Development and request that such officers are seconded. We'll come to whether this is working or not. Now, in order for the conditional release of offenders to be successful, there is need to address the legal and sentencing issues aimed at reducing the numbers being detained and to put rehabilitation at the center of the justice system. So with this in mind, the system is expected to deliver on the objectives of non-custodial sentences, which we've already alluded to. Now, under the Parole Rules of 2008, a prisoner cannot be released to parole unless he has agreed to conditions of his parole. So there you have the collaboration between the correctional service and the offender himself. So the offender must agree to the conditions that are set for his actual release. Now, the fact that the granting of parole revolves around conditions to be agreed upon by the offender, including restrictions on liberty, because it's not full-blown liberty that he will enjoy. He still has a certain degree of it's not total freedom, in other words. So there will be need for sufficient manpower to supervise and ensure that this parolee is abiding by the conditions of that parole. Now, in the Zambian context, there's every danger that one will agree to the conditions for the sake of being released and then abscond later on. So the framework for the law, policy, and practice needs to be reviewed from time to time to ensure that it is meeting the aspirations of the system. And here we are drawn in the submission that the one who is eligible for parole is a person or a convict who has less than 6 months left of his sentence. So chances are that they'll agree to the conditions of parole, but you do have a deviant who, even with just 6 months left to serve, will decide to breach the conditions. So the whole essence of needing to ensure that there's manpower to supervise this minimizes the possible breaches. Coming to the role of civil society and non-state actors, we have agreed that rehabilitation and reintegration is a specialized area because they're dealing with almost a criminal mind. So you need to really be specialized so that you can properly monitor and rehabilitate this person. So here we note that the Tokyo rules have been instructive in this regard, particularly Rule 22.1, which recommends linkages to relevant agencies to facilitate establishment of services relating to social development, social welfare, to enable a well-rounded system. So here we're talking about the role of civil society, which should be working in coordination with the prison administration. And the Mandela rules are also coming to support this need for linkages. So in Zambia, we currently have several civil society organizations working in this area, most relevant being the Prison Care and Counselling Association, PRISCA, which was founded by ex-prisoners. who advocate for prisoners and a balanced and humane system of imprisonment and reintegration of offenders into society. We also have the AIDS Alliance and AIDS and Rights Alliance for Southern Africa, ERASA, which supports civil society actors to advance a human-based response to HIV in Southern Africa that is arising out of the prevalence of HIV in prisons. For any others, we haven't come across any, but these are the ones that were most prominent, and we know that together and severally they have been able to operate in the area of advocacy for human rights. They've also continued to advocate for reforms and rehabilitation and reintegration of inmates back into their communities. They also undertake socio-economic activities as one of the key ways of preventing reoffending. And this is one area where we'd like to highlight the civil society engagement or partnership with government and the correctional service in particular. Coming to the challenges in administration of parole and the correctional supervision, several challenges have been identified in a report of the Auditor General of 2014, which is still largely the position. So between 2014 and now, the situation hasn't really changed much. And this also stems from anecdotal evidence, conversations conducted with the Correctional Service as well as the Parole Board. So this report has stated that the objectives of rehabilitation and reintegration have not been met. The reasons put forward included that most measures imply some restrictions on liberty, and some offenders may fail to comply, and it automatically results in a breach of conditions to be observed by the offender and may result in modification or total revocation of the non-custodial measure. The prisons also remain overcrowded because despite putting in place the parole system, not all who applied for it are granted parole. So there's the option to apply for it, but not everyone is actually granted parole. And parole hearings are delayed for whatever reason, because one of the instances that actually came out was that allowances are not paid. So the board is reluctant to sit. Therefore, this parole is actually failing on an administrative issue. The National Parole Board also is not an independent or final arbiter in the administration of parole. It makes recommendations to the Commission of Prisons, who in turn can either approve or disapprove the conditional release. The fact that it is a mere extension of the correctional service, I think, is the inbuilt fatality of its operations. Another of the challenges is the lack of presence of the National Parole Board in the provinces, despite the fact that they have been provided for in the Act and should actually be wherever there's a prison. There is also the challenge of inadequate human and institutional capacity. These parole officers are not trained in the administration of parole, and training is further hampered by the high staff turnover in the correctional service. So the lack of permanence means that as soon as they train whatever number, these ones leave the service, therefore depleting the expertise or the capacity of the correctional service to actually supervise parole. The all-weather challenge of lack of funding has also been raised, and it is compounding all the other challenges as well, such as the failure to pay allowances and also to establish parole units in the provinces. It was indicated that there are no monitoring reports of prisoners released on parole, despite this being a duty under the Parole Rules. Therefore, it becomes difficult to determine whether it's effective, and there is no way to gauge the success rate of rehabilitation and reintegration thereof. There's also the challenge of failure to comply with the international standards to domesticate international legislation, the provisions of the relevant regional and international conventions. This is aside from the Tokyo Rules and the Mandela Rules, which are actively being used, but they have not really been domesticated fully into legislation. but there is, here we can actually say there's some effort made at ensuring that the criminal justice system is actually implementing them without them being in the full body of the law. There's also the challenge related to the lack of a comprehensive policy on internal security for direction on how to deal with prisoners and also to address rehabilitation, address reintegration. Therefore, it is done ad hoc. If there's a particular prisoner of interest, then something is invoked to deal with that particular aspect, but there's no policy, comprehensive policy governing this. How we can enhance parole and correctional supervision. This can only be answered once we've reviewed the challenges that we mentioned, the shortcomings of the parole and correctional supervision system. And so the PMRC offers the following recommendations to enhance the administration of parole. Our first recommendation is to provide psychological counselling as part of the correctional services. This will entail engaging more qualified psychologists, not more qualified, but larger numbers, more numbers of qualified psychologists in the correctional service. This is against the objective of correctional services being to reform and not to punish. Of course, it's understood that there is need to balance the needs of society and the needs of the offender. So at some point there should be a meeting of the minds. But if the rehabilitation is effective, then society will be more than willing to accommodate this offender. Which takes us to the next point. The fact that the correctional service is already short of trained staff is an opportunity to strengthen collaboration with other institutions, such as the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services, which has the necessary expertise in the probation officers, in the social welfare officers. They've actually been trained to conduct the work that the correctional service needs in order to perform its work. So shared expertise here can help the correctional services without necessarily burdening officers with added responsibilities. It is also recognized that the Probation of Offenders Act stipulates that the supervisory function should be by order of the court. Now, this is sufficient evidence to ensure that there's a memorandum of understanding that they can use to consider supervision, sharing the supervision function with the ministry. The training can also then be used as an incentive. Examples here we've given of Tanzania, where this is actually working effectively. And so we'll do well to borrow that as a best practice model. In terms of policy formulation, the non-custodial measures should be systematically planned and implemented as an integral part of the criminal justice system and not as an ad hoc measure. So an essential part of this planning process is to involve both public and private bodies in the organization and promotion of research on non-custodial sentences or non-custodial treatment of offenders. Here we are leaning on Rule 20, which says research and information mechanisms should be built into the criminal justice system. So we already have something that we can anchor these interventions on. The National Parole Board would function better if it was an autonomous body and not merely an appendage to the correctional systems, because then it would independently make its own decisions, review parole cases, and make the final decisions. Unlike the current situation where they must then take it back to the Commissioner of Prisons to make the final decision, it actually makes their work an academic exercise. It really doesn't go anywhere. We are also interested in public education and sensitization on the benefits of parole. If this can be embedded into the communication strategy of the Zambia Correctional System through the National Parole Board, it would actually be a win for both institutions, and it would also serve the community better, because then they would know what the parole is all about. This is because parole is a community-based correctional model, and community involvement is critical for the success of parole, and information dissemination is a key component of this success. The benefits of parole are not appreciated by society, and early release of a prisoner is always deemed by the community to be a failure. the quicker a person can be rehabilitated and reintegrated back into society, the lesser the chances of reoffending. And so this can only be anchored in communication of the benefits of parole, explaining what it is and what the benefits are for the offender as well as for the community itself. That is our submission.
Most grateful, Madam.
I must say that so far I've gotten a very good definition of parole of this submission. So far, for me, it's one which is convincing, Chair. Now, in the submission and title background, you're saying decongestion of prisons was the main objective for transformation. Congestion of prisons was the main objective for transformation. I was a little bit confused when I read this, and then I read further down there. There's maybe some little explanation to that, though I would want you to shed more light when you say decongestion of prison is the main objective for transforming them. And then in your submission, writing on this very one, I think you are suggesting that when people are overcrowded, it's difficult to supervise them, and maybe they end up being hardcore criminals, some of them. So would you then suggest that the country should maybe build more prisons? And what is your take if the country was to build VIP prisons? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. Mine is a simple one. It's not simple, but a straightforward one. We have a challenge where members of the community don't seem to accommodate ex-convicts very well. In your view, who should do the sensitization to members of the public so that they're able to accommodate the ex-convicts very well? Thank you.
A few years ago, the Zambian prisons embarked on a process to modernize their operations. One of the key changes was changing their name from prisons, the Zambia Prison Service, to the Zambia Correctional Service. But what galvanized the whole process of changing name, changing the entire outlook, was built against the need to, first of all, demystify or make the prisons look more friendly, even in the face of who goes there. The decongestion was also part of it because prison visits revealed that the prisons were operating at beyond maximum capacity. They had up to 3 times the prison populations. I'm afraid I don't have the statistics here, but that if you look at the prisons today, they have prison populations that suggests that what you are doing is further punishing them, whereas the world over, the move has been to sort of look at prisoners as people in need of help. So instead of condemning these prisons, call it a correctional system, because once they go there, you are actually trying to reform them, to make them see the errors of their ways, and such that by the time they've finished serving their prison sentences, for those not serving a life or anything beyond that they can come back into the community and be willing to actually be reintegrated. So this over-incarceration and overcrowding became topical even at international level, because as the international human rights movements sought to see the correctional service doing more friendly events, they started, it got the attention of the Office of the Human Rights Commission, wherein the dialogue started that member states should treat these people better, because we are riding also on the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights. A person being incarcerated does not necessarily suspend some rights. The only right that is taken away from them is the right to liberty. But anything that infringes on a humane treatment of such a person should actually be shied away from. So prison populations and the inherent overcrowding were a concern. Why? In some of these prisons, it's not possible to segregate prisoners. There are also health risks. Here we're talking about communicable diseases, being easy to pass on, which are a further strain on the healthcare system. There's also the strain on resources, because you must clothe the inmates. You must provide them with food. You must provide them with transport to the various areas where they go to work. So what the Zambia Correctional Service was trying to do was decongest the prisons. How were they going to do that? To look at which offenses would attract non-custodial sentences so that you have less traffic going into the prisons and others serving their sentences within the community under supervision. So that's where parole, I think the discussion around parole now gained momentum, because if you are saying the person should serve part of their sentence in the community, there's a question of supervision. This was also riding on the back of community service orders. It's all anchored in supervision. If they are going to work, for instance, the person has committed an offense for which the sentence is a year, you make an order that they perhaps clean your hospital so many days in a week. That way you're decongesting the prison system. But there's a challenge. Who's going to supervise this person? The hospital can't supervise that person because they have their own mandate. So it comes back to the prison service. The prison service does not have the capacity to ensure that you're supervising inmates adequately. So parole was seen as a measure that could be used to ensure that we don't have unnecessary cases going for conviction with custodial sentences when you can actually divert from that. And the latter part of your question, I don't know if I've understood it adequately.
Would you
Recommend VIG?
Would you recommend that the country builds more prisons? And what is your take if we were to talk about VIP prisons, or prisons which can accommodate people with lesser offenses, as opposed to being bundled together with hardcore criminals?
Thank you very much, Honorable Member. Building of more prisons, that hangs in the balance. You build more prisons, you must fill them. Whereas if you determine that some offenses actually don't require custodial sentences, then there'll be no need for the extra prisons. But the prison population that is there, going by the offenses for which they've been convicted, require that custodial sentences be imposed. And as far as the statistics show, there are still not enough prisons for the population that they actually accommodate. So maybe building more to decongest the existing ones and not to bring more to serve. So that, I think, would be a technical issue for the prison, for the correctional services to deal with. But perhaps speaking on behalf of the PMRC, with the background knowledge of how the correctional system has been trying to decongest the prisons, ours would be to build prisons for the deserving, but also ensure that what they are going in there for does not harden them and worsen them, such that by the time they come out, or by the time they serve their sentences, they're in a worse condition than they went. Others have gone in there to serve sentences and have come out terminal. So on that one, that's a loss already for the system. But if you have deserving, yes, we have deserving space for defilers, for murderers, for all those years. If we're going to, for those years, but that is not the purpose of prison. It is not to go and punish them further. The fact that you're taking away their liberty is punishment enough. But if you look at the state of our prisons, it is really not a place where you want to send anybody, who you can divert to a non-custodial sentence, but we still need to supervise them. So that is where this system fails, because we will have non-custodial sentences imposed, but who's going to who's going to supervise them. So I think that is the first challenge that should be taken care of, ensure that the correctional services has capacity for supervision, has capacity to counsel, has capacity to develop skills when they're in there. So if the prison that we are going to build has a skills development center, then it's a welcome prison. If it's a prison where they're just going to sit and languish 24 hours a day, by the time they come back, they are of no use to the society or to the community which we are taking. In relation to the VIP prisons, it is difficult to say for, I think, the reasons that I've already given. Are we going to reform them while they're in there? Rehabilitation, so all those issues come into play. The question, Honorable Member? Sorry, again.
The next one is from Honorable
It was.
Mine was, who is supposed to do the community sensitization in members of the public?
Thank you very much, Honorable Member. Community sensitization will essentially be a joint effort, starting with the mandate holder. The mandate holder here is a correctional service. They know the ins and outs of their system, so they can devise what sort of message they'd like to take out into the community. Then we know that there will be a shortcoming on how the expertise can actually be employed to package the necessary communication strategy. So it first lies with the correctional service to come up with a communication strategy. Then they can work with any other arm of government or indeed with civil society, because civil society has been very strong on advocacy and they have the flexibility to go into the communities with different sorts of messages for different types of messaging that they want to actually reach the community. So for that one, we would recommend that a joint approach is employed, where in the correctional service passes the information on to civil society organizations that are already active. We did make mention of PRISCA. We do know that PRISCA has been strong on advocacy. They work with the communities, and who better to do the advocacy and communication of whatever the message is than the ex-prisoner himself. They have sat through the system, they have served their sentences, so they are better able to come back to the community and speak of their experiences. And also, because you are trying to ensure that the message that goes to the community is to say, don't come into prison, it's really not the place you want to be. So for that one, a joint effort, but it has to be anchored by the correctional service themselves.
Thank you very much, Madam. Any other?
On the challenges that you have availed to this committee, number 2, challenges in the administration of the parole, the correctional supervision. I underline that sentence of saying parole hearings are reported late because on non-payments of allowances for parole board members, leading to apathy. Just on that one. So that entails they could have done all the necessary work that they are supposed to do, and then they hold on to such thing to say, till you pay us, that's when we are going to release the names. That's my take. Now, would you recommend or would you suggest that this parole board should have a standalone budget in order to clear up these matters? Number 2 question is that, looking at the circumstance, the way it is, and emanating from the same statement, in your view, in terms of appointments, we want to get your view in terms of the board, to do with the chairperson, of course the members, the board members, would you recommend either, or what is your view, whether the appointment, the chairperson should come from within the correction service or from any other professionals? Thank you.
We delayed because of non-payment of allowances. We measured this against other similar boards, and how allowances are paid and why this was particularly a factor. But Chairperson, Honourable Member, you do notice that in our recommendations, we did allude to the need for the parole board being converted into an administrative tribunal, which would then attract a budget of its own, because then it would be independent of the correctional service. So that if it has this autonomy to sit, determine its own sittings, maybe it would be governed by a statute. I don't know, there would have to be a modality for its creation, which governs its autonomy, governs its financing. That would cure the two issues we have here: the delay in parole hearings and thus admitting persons to parole. It would also cure the issue of payment of sitting allowances. So we stand by this recommendation that converting the National Parole Board into an autonomous institution would come with the budget, and it would also expedite its functions. Yes. As to how it will be constituted, if, for instance, it is created by a statute, then it would have a board that is set out in the statute, and the composition would be governed by a statute, and that takes care of the chairpersonship, whether it's from the correctional service or from outside. But because if it was established by an act of parliament, it would stipulate who the board members are, and that would already take care of the chairmanship. If it falls into the correctional services, then so be it, but it would have to be deliberated before the act of parliament is actually agreed to. The board then have been canvassed and agreed to by stakeholders. That way it would solve its problem.
Follow-up question. In your own view, your own opinion, yes, we can bring those statutes in, just in your own opinion, to whether we take, especially at the level of chairpersonship. Would you recommend comes from within the correction service or from other bodies or other professions? Just your opinion.
Be comfortable with the chairperson coming from outside the system, because that person would be neutral and not liable to any interference, whether political or from the system itself. They would be operating from what is presented before them, so there will be no undue influence on some of the decisions they make. Outside, in terms of profession, it could be any profession. It could be a counselor, for instance, an expert in psychology. So, bottom line, an independent person who is not in any way related to the correctional service.
Question of impartiality and
Yes, Honourable Chair.
Thank you very much. I don't know, I seem to be quite happy with your submission. Very independent and objective. However, you talked about prisoners enjoying their rights, and the only right which is deprived of them is freedom to liberty. But these prisoners are also allowed to vote right now. What is your take on that? Two, would you recommend that we should have parole boards in each and every province in Zambia to help mitigate this inefficiency which is prevailing right now, where all the issues pertaining to parole are dealt centrally? The third question is, I don't know in your research if you've ever come across a term community sentencing, and what is your definition on community sentencing, or how do you understand it? I hope you are taking notes of this. Yeah, the other question is, we have a parole board, and I know that prisoners are supposed to be released on parole. I don't know whether the same parole is the same one which is exercised by the president, because all we hear most of the time is he was released on presidential pardon. When do we have the parole board make recommendations for prisoners or inmates to be released on parole, independent of presidential decisions? The last one is, would you say that the correctional service is not well funded, or there's just some inefficiency in their system? Thank you, Chair.
Madam, we would attend to that.
Chairperson, thank you, Honourable Member. On the question of the rights that are infringed, the main one that comes to mind when a person is imprisoned is that they automatically lose their right to freedom of movement, liberty in general. They are now falling into a system where they are regulated. That's the first one that comes to mind. But they also lose other rights. They lose economic rights. They lose enjoyment of a number of social rights, in addition to civil and political rights. The one right that has recently been restored is the right to vote. This, I think, came by way of legislative reform, as recent as 2020. I don't know where this motivation came from to capture the prison population to vote, but it is a comfort that even if they've lost their liberty and they've lost the right to expression, freedom of expression, and all these other attainment rights, that they can still participate in the electoral system. So this particular one has recently been restored, but we are not privy to what it is that motivated it to be done. But it is an important right to restore, because when they're in prison, there's only so much that they can do. So for us, I think it's an important right to restore because it falls under the ambit of civil and political rights, and it is in keeping with the conventions that Zambia has ratified and is a state party to. Here in particular, it's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So that is an important civil right, the right to vote, and that it has been restored to prisoners, we think is progressive, only as far as being a state party to the convention is concerned. You point to the question of whether the parole board should have a presence in all the provinces. During the course of our research, that was one of the shortcomings, that the parole board is not present in all the provinces, despite provincial national parole boards being provided for in the Act. So here, this is just a question now of the administrative hurdles that have since met with actualizing this part of the legislation, that it should actually be dealt with, because the law already says there should actually be in all the provinces. It would not be affected if autonomy, for instance, was granted to the board, because it would simply be lifting those powers from the existing legislation to actually maintain the presence in the provinces, because then access will be easier. Wherever there's a prison, the parole board should also be present. On the question of what is community service, yes, we have community
sentencing.
community sentencing, which is the community service order that is provided by the court. This again is one of those non-custodial measures that we'll be referring to in our submission. As we are trying to decongest the prisons, what measures are available? Parole is one of them. The community sentence is another one. This one is anchored I think this one is anchored again in the Ministry of Community Development and Social Welfare, because they are the ones which has the staff. They've got the social welfare officer who is present throughout the country at district level. So serving a community service order is actually a very good non-custodial measure, because it would go back to the main objective of the reforms that the prison service undertook, part of decongesting the prisons. So in terms of what the legislation now looks like, I'm not particularly aware, but I do know there was some effort through the Law Development Commission to ensure that the community sentence order was reactivated to ensure that it was running in tandem with what the correctional service was trying to do, move people away from the prisons as a measure of decongesting the prisons. On the question of parole versus the presidential pardon, the two are actually not the same. The presidential pardon is the preserve of the president at the time. He has the powers to invoke that part of the Constitution where he can pardon any number of convicted persons on recommendation of the Commissioner of Prisons, whereas the parole board is feeding into the same commissioner for persons who have got 6 months or less of their sentence to serve. These do not qualify for the presidential pardon because they'll have served. They can be pardoned any time before, but if they are within the 6 months to completion, then the pardon, I don't think, kicks in. I think there's some technical or administrative issue involved there. But one is the preserve of the president through recommendation of the prison service, the Commissioner of Prisons, and the other one is falls under the mandate of the National Parole Board. On your question relating to funding, would it work better if it was funded better? Definitely. Everything works better with just a little more money, because then it would solve some of the challenges they have. They would recruit their own social welfare officers and not necessarily have to lean on the Ministry of Community Development. They would engage psychologists of their own. They would be better able to clothe and take care of the prisoners that they already have. In terms of increased funding, they would pay those allowances that are now proving troublesome to delaying parolees actually being put on parole. So funding, yes, it would actually be a very, very helpful mechanism to unlock the potential that the correctional service has. We do know for a fact that they operate in under challenging conditions. So funding is will definitely go a long way.
Thank you, Madam.
So it's not inefficiency, it's funding, according to your findings.
The inefficiency would definitely be cured with increased funding.
Thank you. The last one from Honorable.
To say, having interacted with the National Parole Board and the Correction Service, how do you rate the performance of the Parole Board in the last 1 year or 2 years? Thank you.
In terms of rating, we would have had to interact with them more closely in order to give a fair rating. But going by the research and conversations with the Correctional Service, They are doing a remarkable job in a difficult environment. So in all fairness, perhaps if it was on a scale of 1 to 10, we'd give them 5.